This week, developers, including Epic, are fighting back against crunch. EA's Andrew Wilson has explained the company value system without saying the word money. CD Projekt Red is actually doing something very good indeed, and a whole bunch more. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Roundup, our Tuesday and Friday gaming news show. This one has some pretty positive stories from quite a few people. We've got a solid stance from Epic, from Bungie, a whole bunch of game news, so you know what, let's just get right into it with Fortnite. Fortnite's shiny throne is losing a little bit of its luster as the game's revenue is down 38% year on year, according to super data for this month, with it still retaining the top grossing spot on console and dropping down to 5th on the PC platform. Based on the revenue numbers that we already know, that means that Fortnite has earned about $203 million this month, so you know what, it's not time to ring the death knells just yet. As easy as it is to look at a downward trend and start doomsaying, I think Fortnite was just an extreme peak, and it will begin to stabilize at a lower level now that that's really kind of sort of trended off. And like with all trends and fads, it's going to have its time in the spotlight, and as players leave the game, there aren't really going to be new audiences for the game to pick up, despite their best efforts to keep the content flowing. Saying that, it still is the absolute king of its genre in terms of player engagement and revenue, so it's going to take something pretty mighty to take that top spot from it. And as much as auto chess might be the newest fad genre at the minute, I don't quite think it's got the mass market appeal that the battle royales do. And then on the topic of Fortnite, we've got a surprisingly good move from Epic in the wake of the industry discussing crunch quite widely, and Epic, of course, being one of the large stories there. They have retaliated by giving their Fortnite studio 2 weeks off work. Yep, a fortnight. While having 2 weeks off work won't exactly make up for 2 years or 56 fortnights of crunch, it definitely is a show of good faith from the company. They reportedly have content scheduled to go live during that break, and they have contingencies in place for solving any major issues that may arise. They are a company after all, and the show must go on. At the same time though, this is a pretty good move. They have already mandated a 2-week break in December, so another one in July is good. That should give the employees plenty of benefit, and you know, as much as I'd love to claim that this is a carefully calculated PR stunt, and a part of it may well be, this news was buried in one line at the bottom of a regular blog post for Fortnite, so it seems like a decently genuine move for their part for their employees' health, which I'm sure the employees will be happy about. And let's be real, if that gets to a bad state, it will damage Epic, so they kind of do need to do it. Now, there's actually somewhat of a trend of companies making these gestures, because Bungie have now thrown their hat in the ring. So during GuardianCon, Luke Smith was asked when the Lord of Wolves shotgun would be fixed, because it's currently dominating PvP mode because it's just so darn strong, and he spoke openly and clearly, saying that they could ask people to work extra long to cram that fix into the next patch and, you know, speed up that process, but they've been saying internally that they, you know, want to care about their employees' work-life balances more. He even said that recently they pushed their team with an aspect of the raid, and they don't feel like they can ask them to sacrifice time so soon after doing that. And it's kind of telling how there's a lack of agility in game dev of this size, and how, their tools will allow for changes to happen nearly immediately in the game engine, but those changes will have to fit into a patch cycle, which will include significant testing, certification, and approval from all parties involved. It can be kind of hard, I think, from a consumer perspective to imagine just how it could take a lot of time to nerf a gun's stats. But it would have to be nerfed correctly by designers, which will take time in gameplay testing. It will have to be added to the patch and then tested and sent through any submission or approval processes with BNet, Sony, and Microsoft. Speed is the enemy of accuracy, and when you're on a huge project like this that recently had 1 million daily users, accuracy is vital. All in all, though, it was just good to see what Luke Smith said. I think it's definitely the right thing to do, and hopefully we see more of this as a trend in the future. I mean, hell, even EA are slipping in some employee-friendly behavior, but we'll get to that in a bit. So, our next story. EA's CEO Andrew Wilson sat down for a lengthy interview with Game Daily at E3, and it was published a few days ago. There's quite a lot to glean from the interview, so let's just get right into it. So, First up, they talked about Battlefront 2. According to Andrew, it's doing fine with a net promoter score of 30, which suggests that customers are largely positive about the game, and indeed I have heard that the game is in a far better state than launch. He admits that they messed up a lot at launch, but that the team promised a lot and that EA had faith in that team, so they continue to run with the project. He then spoke about how their values have grown at EA and what they've adapted since he took over 6 years ago. This value system, which apparently is focusing on creativity, passion, and risk-taking, I mean, of course you'd say that, as well as faith in developers, is why he says they're happy to continue on development with Battlefront 2 and Anthem, whereas, quote, lesser studios... Yup, that's the words the man said. Lesser studios would have dropped those projects and moved on. Now, on the topic of Anthem itself, Andrew said that the IP lives for generations and has a 7 to 10 year cycle, and that EA feels that over the 7 to 10 year cycle, the Anthem team will get there with something that's great and is special. He also had some very flattering things to say about BioWare themselves. Wilson compared them to Steven Spielberg, saying that even though not every game is a smash hit, they do have a history of high quality games and their current team has fantastic potential. He says they're fully aware that Anthem has major issues, but that the core of the game's world and gameplay is compelling, and that if they didn't truly believe in those things, then they would not be continuing to invest in it. And while I'm inclined to agree that it's the right thing to do for devs and customers to stick with the project, and the game actually might be able to recover and be quite good, I do think that there's also an element of that. There's just a large sunk cost that they really want to recover. Now, despite what he says, EA, they are absolutely acting in self-interest. It's not like they're doing, all of these values out of the good of their heart. And if we're going to be more realistic about what Wilson said, or more accurately what he didn't say, well, look, the project was a disaster from a management perspective, as detailed in Kotaku's report. Wilson did not speak to those problems. He's clearly aware of them. He's the CEO of the company. I don't think this article proves that he's blind and ignorant to the problems of Anthem. I think he knows just fine well what they are. But he knows that that's a PR wave that he could do with dodging, as much as personally I do think that gamers would find it refreshing to hear a candid take instead of the standard corporate talk, which just ends up coming off as being not clued in and out of touch. Next, in the interview though, he talked a whole lot of fluff about monetization, and this was kinda dumb. So he said that he believes that the core of a successful and fair monetization system is a positive value perception and satisfying the human need to get a good deal. In his own words, we really think about 4 key vectors: value, fairness, choice, and fun. He wants us to feel like we've got a good deal. He continued on saying that they have some of the microtransaction fuel live services that have the highest sentiment and engagement in the industry, and when he says that, I imagine he's talking about FIFA Ultimate Team, which I don't think many people will agree fits with those 4 vectors, being a random pay-to-win mechanic added to a full-price game. Now, he went on to explain FIFA Ultimate Team in the same way that people always have, by comparing them to physical trading cards. There's a big difference there. With physical trading cards, you can actually sort of trade them for real money, which actually does kind of change some of the value, and actually could make them more gambling-prone than something where you can't cash out. But you know what? I don't think those trading cards are particularly consumer-friendly in the first place anyway. I don't particularly like how elements of that market work, so it's not like that's a good thing, Andrew. Now, further to this, Andrew said, quote, "We want to talk to a lot of regulators around the world." And then he went on to say, if it's ultimately found that any form of monetization is inappropriate, we'll do something different. And I think we know what Andrew means there. So Andrew and the lads at EA are more than happy to continue as long as regulators don't step in and consumers still keep on throwing money at them hand over fist, which, with things like Ultimate Team, they certainly are. Now, this is all coming out after the abysmal showing that EA put on for UK Parliament, surprise mechanics. We've already covered that on the channel, and that does sort of put Wilson's stance into perspective. Words mean nothing because even if he means those words, their games are full of predatory behavior that they just refuse to see the problem with. When they have a different definition of fair and a different definition of good value, well, the argument's impossible to have because they're just out of touch with their customers, or at least they're more engaged customers, let's just say, and because of that, sometimes it feels like it's not worth having the discussion. Now, there was a lot more in this interview, but it's mostly just Wilson reaffirming what we already know from EA. They're going to push hard with games as a service, big surprise, and they think that is what players want. and coincidentally, just happens to be something that is more profitable than the traditional AAA games model. They're also going to be pushing for cloud and subscription adoption because of the additional reach that those things could have, with Wilson ultimately saying this: "I actually think that games like Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order will have 30, 40, 50 million play, that kind of game in the context of a subscription, whereas maybe only 10 to 12 million might have played it if it was absent from a subscription." He largely believes that cloud and subscription-based gaming will basically drive the same disruption for games as it has for television and music, but we'll have to wait and see, and there's a lot of downsides there that I will talk about in a lot of detail in the future. I suppose what he could be meaning is if you look at, say, how many people watched Bright on Netflix, well, that's a lot more people than would have seen that movie in theaters, so you can kind of see that even if that's not an apples to apples comparison, that's kind of what he means. Now, this interview, I mean, it seemed from the heart, it seemed personal enough, but it really does just come off as kind of the corporate talk, a little bit out of touch, and really in a lot of the core issues, it's pretty clear that there's not really a middle ground to be found. Now, there is one last thing with EA that sort of is a positive note. Executives, including Wilson, have refused to take their their cash-based anyway, performance bonuses this year, adding their share to the pool for distribution among lower-level employees. This has resulted in close to $5 million being put into employee bonuses, although possibly more. Now, this hasn't stopped things like regular stock sell-offs or dividends or anything like that, and I believe it is just the cash bonus, so even if it is a token gesture, given that their performance definitely is under question this year, turning down millions of dollars because you don't feel like you've earned it, that is a decent enough thing, and that, I guess, should be encouraged. Next, though, let's get into some really positive CD Projekt Red news. This is through an interview with Prima Games, and they've said that they are considering expansions in the vein of Witcher 3 for Cyberpunk 2077. However, they haven't really got much to say yet because they want to make sure that everything in the game itself is complete. Now, given the quality of Witcher 3's expansions, I really think many will be pleased to hear that about Cyberpunk 2077, that it could be, just getting that treatment, which for Witcher 3 was incredible. That game's expansions were brilliant, and I'm sure many were relieved to hear that there's, no sort of live service updates or anything like that going on. And then just on a more personal note, I mean, what I remember in games is Warcraft 3, Frozen Throne, which, that was an expansion for Warcraft 3 that had a campaign the size of Warcraft 3. It was really big. It did a lot for the game. The stuff that I remember from back in the day, it's the old style of expansions that truly were expansions. Whereas a lot of the time you just see these weird DLCs that are kind of small and really a pretty darn bad value. Even things like, say, the Shivering Isles for Oblivion, that was really good. So it's just nice seeing that things like that again. Now, true, it's not going to become the norm of the industry, I think, but still, it is good that there are people like CD Projekt Red who are still out there doing that sort of thing, and by all accounts, doing it pretty darn well. Moving on though, well, expansions and live services aren't the only way to add content to a game post-launch, because there is also community content. Microsoft have claimed that Microsoft Flight Simulator is going to be adding support for community content, so third-party development and content creation specifically. Now, for a game like this, I think it's the only real way to go. Sims are a super powerful niche, they have small but very effective and dedicated communities, and honestly, the new Flight Sim looks pretty damn cool from what they showed at E3. So working alongside and just relying on that kind of community, that's going to make for a great experience for years to come after the game is initially released, and I'm sure that this is really good news for fans of the series. I really just do like it when I see devs cater to a niche in such a good way like that. I mean, sure, it's pragmatic for the devs, but in this case, I just think it's a really nice story, and it's absolutely the sort of thing we want to be seeing. Then next, Watch Dogs Legion. So we've covered adding content to games, but what about games that seemingly just have way too much to begin with? Well, in an interview with Edge, Watch Dogs Legion's creative director said that the game does not play the same way twice. They have 20 different versions of the script with different characters, voices, and even acting. They've combined human photogrammetry, new animation techniques, and voice modulation technology to create unique heads and voices for characters. These sort of wild claims about, a different experience every time, that's usually the domain of roguelites, like small-scale indies or RPGs in the past. but seeing this kind of tech being used in big AAA, that certainly is interesting. Now, the backbone still has to be done by human writing and content generation, it would seem. So I don't think we're going to be blown away by a different game every single time you play this, but I certainly think there's a little bit of truth in the creative director's statement of your story is going to be uniquely yours. Now, as to whether, that's entirely true or it just feels that way, we'll have to wait and see, but I certainly am intrigued. Then next, we've got to talk about Capcom. So one of the aspects of modern gaming that I'm quite worried about is the reliance on old games and old IP. Creativity sometimes just seems to go by the wayside outside of the indie realm. Well, Capcom are kind of one of the worst for this, with basically all of their successful games being remakes or re-releases of old games. Now, they're good games, in many cases, absolutely, but they're not new. They haven't released a new game, like a new IP, since Dragon's Dogma in 2012. Well, one of their development heads has alleviated these fears somewhat, telling Video Games Chronicle that, quote, Capcom will never take our eye off creating original games in the future. A few other employees added to this as well, with the Monster Hunter World Iceborne director saying they're confident they can create new experiences that will resonate with people. However, it seems that they won't be making massive bets on new IP, that'll be more of a sort of AA scale thing to test the waters. After all, their huge last project, Deep Down, well, that's been missing in action for years now, so they may have learned a lesson there, a lesson that I hope other developers will learn as well. So, that will do us for another episode of The Roundup. This certainly was a pretty large, beefy one, a lot of super interesting topics, so let me know what you think about today's stories down below, especially that Andrew Wilson interview. I think that was quite an odd one to parse through. It is all just corporate talk, it's a bit weird. So, that's it for me. We're going to have another deep dive on the way soon, and I have got beta access to GOG Galaxy 2.0, so yeah, we'll get onto that pretty soon too. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.